question for Dr. Zilvian to introduce the history of oral history, the idea of the conception, methodology. Then I'll go into Natalie's Queen's Memory Project, then their story.io, and then we'll hear from Marion about real-world experience and practices. All right, folks, welcome, everyone. This is the DLIS Student Association special summer webinar on professional development, covering the topic of oral history in the age of digital storytelling. I'm Michael Crossfox from the Division of Library and Information Science at St. John's University, and I'll quickly introduce our esteemed panel today. We're going to be hearing from Zach Ellis, who is the founder and CEO of theirstory.io. Also joining us is Natalie Milbrot, the director of the Queen's Memory Project. We have on hand Dr. Kristen Zilvian, the coordinator of the Masters of Arts in Public History at St. John's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and also Marion Ward, a graduate student in our dual degree program, MA Public History and MS Library and Information Science. I'm your moderator, Michael Crossfox of the Division of Library and Information Science. Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us today. Dr. Zilvian, if you could please talk to us about the evolution of oral history, its origins, applications, and its uses in our dual degree curriculum.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I think one way of thinking about the issue that we are examining today is to think about yourself as maybe a newly minted Master of Library and Information Science student that's starting a new job, or you're already an established professional, but your responsibilities or your employer has changed. And you discover one of the more interesting things about your new job is that the institution, the organization, the corporation, the archives has an oral history collection. And once you get on board, you discover that, yes, indeed, there's an oral history collection, but there's everything from files that are currently being stored in the cloud to a few flash drives that someone put in an envelope that have more digital files on them. Then you open a few file cabinets or closet doors and discover, oh, there's the whole analog world sitting there in front of me with cassette tapes and shoe boxes, and even a couple funny square-looking boxes with reels in them that you suspect belong to this technology called reel-to-reel. And then just as you're shutting that cabinet, you see these bunch of discs there, and you don't even know what they are. But you find out later that there's this short-lived DAT technology that was also used in oral history. And then you shut that cabinet door, that closet door, and go, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? I had no idea that just the technology could be so complicated, or that there could be so many changes that have taken place in such a short amount of time. So our goal here for our seminar is to help you as a library and information science student or a professional already working in the field to prepare for a workplace or possibly a volunteer opportunity that is going to be actively involved in a minority of instances in the active collection of oral history or digital storytelling programs. Or there may be an opportunity for you where you are curating an existing collection, and you are doing your best to implement best practices involving preservation and accessibility. So you may not be actively collecting, but you've got all this material that you want your users to be able to readily access. And so those are, of course, our goals this morning, our goals for our webinar. And we have, as you already heard from Michael, three guests that will give us some insight into examining this kind of complicated scenarios that you may possibly face. So my job is, of course, to talk very briefly about oral history and digital history, just to kind of set a baseline for us in our webinar so that everybody's clear on what exactly we're talking about. And in the case of oral history, there is, of course, many long-standing human tradition of keeping oral accounts of things that have happened, and this is something that unites mankind over time and place. And there have been certain individuals in many societies who were charged with this task of being the memory of that community. In some West African societies, they use the term the griot. And this person is a high status person who has dedicated their life to learning the oral traditions. And of course, there are corollaries to the griot in other societies and in other time periods as well. The point is that at one time, oral traditions, or always have oral traditions been highly valued as sources of insight, understanding, and guidance. And of course, that changes greatly in the late 19th and early 20th century, when we're taking a huge leap forward in the interest of time, when we begin to have mechanical recording devices. And that technology advances very, very rapidly, in part thanks to the World Wars, which improved the basis for that technology, so that by the 1960s, kids like me are getting for Christmas inexpensive cassette recorders that can be used to make and exchange tapes. But while there are, people, kids like me, playing with these things, oral history becomes kind of embedded in certain institutions and organizations in the 1960s. And this is led by the United States military. Certainly, there are government departments like the Department of State and the United States Senate that have long-standing oral history programs. And then we see other public and private organizations, corporations that have also embraced oral history. So it's become embedded right in, the way that these organizations, corporations, and institutions do things. They see it of value that when people are retiring, for example, or being promoted in the corporate world, to have an oral history interview or a big policy change takes place can be of tremendous value. So jumping forward, we can see that when we're talking about the use of analog oral history in the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s, bicentennial years, which were the golden age of oral history, there was at the same time major changes taking place in American society. The civil rights movement, which of course was by that time already centuries old, had made some strides and had gotten a legal basis for the demands that had been long made in the form of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the additions to that in 1968. And we also have not only a demand for examining the contributions of people of color to American society at that time, but a much broader sweep in terms of acknowledging women, workers, LGBTQ people, the migrants and immigrants. At that time, changes in the industrial production and manufacturing in the United States made many blue-collar workers feel that their world was changing, and they were a particular focus of many of these oral history projects. So we had many groups that were the focus that had a sense of being silenced, of being marginalized, of being not part of the full picture of American society. And of course, moving ahead, ultimately we have technical, excuse me, before I abandon the oral history, the interviews that were made at that time were ones that are characterized by several different kind of attributes. First of all, most of the oral history interviews, to kind of be an oral history interview, to define an oral history interview, they were pretty formal in the sense that there was a clear narrator-interviewer relationship, and although there's much disagreement in the field about this, some believe that the interview was supposed to be clearly under the control of the interviewer, and the narrator was kind of to be mined, if you will, for sort of information. Also, the oral history interview, in addition to this kind of formal relationship between the interviewer and the narrator, is that the interviewer came to the table with much expectations of a great deal of preparation and research. And this might involve archival research, it might involve reading secondary and primary source literature, or even gaining field experience before one felt equipped to do this type of interviewing. It also was characterized by important, detailed attention given to copyright laws, and the conveying of one's intellectual property rights, and it was always this kind of awkward explanations and exchange of property rights and explanations that are the responsibility of the interviewer to make sure that the narrator understands that they're conveying their intellectual property rights to another entity, or today to the commons. So there's any number of collective or ways that these property rights can be shared. The point is that there was always this great deal of emphasis and clarity on this relationship. And then as the interview proceeded, typically they would have a pre-interview session in which the questions, the issues, the procedure would be discussed, and that was separate and distinct from the interview itself. And then what happened during the interview, of course, that the interviewer typically asked the questions and issues that had been previously agreed upon, although not necessarily kind of in terms of the phraseology. Notes were taken. Of course, the recording was taking place, and that interviewer had to watch the sound levels and think of another of different things and make sure that the little wheels of the tapes were turning away. And then perhaps most importantly, to ask follow-up questions and to try to, as in an ethical manner, try to probe and examine issues as fully as possible. And of course, that's where oral history interviewing falls into like the art, right, as opposed to the technical aspects. And then, of course, when the interview was finished, there was this expectation again of kind of firming up the legal responsibilities and the exchange of rights documents that had taken place, of of writing formal letters of thanks, and most importantly, of getting the interview fully transcribed, and in most instances, returning that transcription to the interviewee so that they had, or the informant, so that they had an opportunity to examine it before we move forward. So we go into this, long explanation so that you can see that should you have oral history transcripts sitting on your shelf, or an interview in some format, whether it's analog or digital, that is the result of a long thought out process in oral history that involved a great deal of work before the interview ever took place. And part of that work was determining where would that oral history interview live? Who would be responsible ultimately for its preservation and accessibility? And before a single interview was made, all of those questions and issues should be ironed out. And typically, for well-run, best practice oriented oral history projects, that is exactly how they did run. You knew where, as I said, this material was going, the support material, the notes, everything before the project even started. So I go into this again, sort of long explanation now, to look at how the advent of digital technology brought some changes to both the procedure of oral history in terms of the actual mechanics and the devices being used, but more importantly, it has changed some other aspects of how oral history used to proceed. By coincidence, just this morning, my local National Public Radio affiliate station played an interview that had been recorded with StoryCorps. And if you're not familiar with StoryCorps, this is an entity that's been in existence now for over a decade and probably longer, founded in New York, which makes it possible for people to visit StoryCorps booths, StoryCorps trailers, which again, you can pay a reasonable fee and have those brought to your community. And people are invited to come, make an appointment online, come to the StoryCorps trailer and tell your story. And you not only get a copy of the digital file that you've created, a subject index that's linked with the calibrations and the time of the, running through the interview, but more importantly, your file is shared with the Library of Congress. And so again, I happened to hear this morning on National Public Radio an interview that was on StoryCorps that was made locally. And it's really wonderfully characteristic of what the best that StoryCorps can offer, because it involved and does by kind of characteristic in the sense of its being digital storytelling, in my estimation, that these are rather informal, almost like you're listening to someone's chat with someone else, someone telling a story. That typically the interviewer is a person who is personally known to the narrator. It's your son, it's your cousin, it's a coworker, it's a fellow vet, it's another person who has shared or knew of these experiences. Oftentimes, digital stories are pretty short, lengthwise, pretty focused, fairly narrow. It's an incident that happened or an experience. It's typically not, unlike in oral history, a life course interview where you start a childhood and a family and kind of run through someone's career, for example, or craft or trade kind of thing. They're pretty focused, and in this case, as I said, why this one was so emblematic of the best of digital storytelling, it was the experience of someone who had been formerly incarcerated, was found great difficulty in finding a job despite that person's education, and then ultimately meeting someone who was a college graduate and forming a long-term relationship that is now 22 years between those two individuals. And so it was really focusing on, kind of the occupational, the class, the background differences between these two people, and how it's possible for people to have such wonderful, caring, kind of build strong relationships, despite what they saw as this kind of sea of difference between their two pasts. So that's what I mean by something that was very kind of focused and on kind of an individual, or in this case, a set of individuals that can oftentimes characterize digital storytelling. In the case of StoryCorps, as indicated, what StoryCorps provides is a not a full transcription, but a list of topics so that one could go back and find the exact time in the interview where something about, for example, this individual had worked at Taco Bell now for 22 years. And he spoke about, what it was like for him to work in fast food, for example. That's something that a researcher may be interested in, and you would be able to go right into those exact spots as a result. So the digital storytelling, of course, when it is archived with the Library of Congress, it is going out there for prosperity, right? It is being shared, it is accessible, and could potentially be used for researchers. But I think that the kind of ambitions for how often or how much digital storytelling will actually be used in research may not be as much as, let's say, those for oral history sponsors, like Columbia University, for example, which has one of the foremost and first of the major oral history programs that are university-based. In other words, they both train, collect, make accessible. They do it all there within their program in different bits and pieces. But whereas there is an element in digital storytelling here, as I'm coming to an end, I promise, that is cathartic for some, right? That helps people kind of deal with their past. Now, that doesn't mean that can't happen in oral history, and sometimes it does. But I think that it is more kind of immediate to the listener, that this digital storytelling experience helps this person in some way gain some insight. So I think that those are all things that will hopefully be of benefit to you thinking about the differences between oral history and digital storytelling. Finally, I want to close with that at St. John's University, where I teach a oral history class that is duly listed in the history department and in the Division of Library and Information Science, is that I really could not teach the class without making or having wonderful collaborative partners in the community. And in terms of the longer standing relationship that we enjoy is with the Queen's Memory Project, and with Natalie Milbrot, who is the founding director of the Queen's Memory Project. And my students volunteer directly for the Queen's Memory Project, and as a result get an opportunity to see all of the different stages of what Natalie and the staff do to make oral history accessible. And that includes getting them experience with the digital tools that they use, products like Audacity, if I'm not mistaken, for transcriptions. And then it was Trent, is it Lent? Trent? I can't recall the name of the product that is used for oral history editing.
We used to use Trent, and now we use Rev.
Rev, okay, sorry, I'm forgetting my brand names there. And so the students would at least have some experience with these. But then moving forward, just this past year, I was just thrilled to great privilege of collaborating with Zach Ellis, who is the developer and the CEO of Bear Story. And this platform is really just a wonder because of the ease that it offers for recording, transcribing, and sharing the clips, the audio clips, the digital files, so that audio clips can be readily shared. And he'll tell you more about Bear Story's capabilities in just a moment. But again, and finally, Marian Ward is with us because we want to give you a kind of student perspective on this all. And Marian has not only experience in dealing with the platforms that have been identified earlier, but then this summer carried that forward with research that he has been doing in oral history, in particular interest in the ethics involving oral history and digital storytelling with people who have suffered trauma and other kinds of disorienting experiences. So Natalie, I'm going to turn it over to you with an acknowledgement of how grateful I am to have the students and myself an opportunity to work under your guidance and with your wonderful staff at the Queen's Memory Project.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's always a pleasure working with you and your students. So my name is Natalie Milgrove. As Kristen mentioned, I'm the founding director of the Queen's Memory Project. And just to give you a little idea of what Queen's Memory is and kind of how we started, we began when I was a graduate student earning my library degree at Queen's College, which is part of the City University of New York system. We began as an oral history project that was funded by a collaborative digitization grant between our university and the public library system in Queens County. And for those who are outside of New York City, there are 3 different public library systems because the city is so massive. And so just the one that's for the borough of Queens has over 60 locations, branches that serve very small areas. Most people live less than a mile from their local library, and so you can walk to them. So it's a really excellent kind of grassroots infrastructure for the kind of project that we wanted to start. So the Queen's Memory Project is really based in a post-custodial model of archiving, meaning that we're not interested in taking people's stuff and putting it in a vault. We're more interested in helping people to preserve their own materials and hold on to them themselves. So we offer consultations to people about safe housing for archival materials that maybe their family or their community possess. And then we digitize things, and we add the digitized version along with expert metadata from the people who know, what date that photo was taken and the names of everybody in the photo, for example, and give us really rich metadata that will be helpful to future researchers. We take the digital version and that metadata into our collections. And Queen's Memory from the very beginning was really just taking in digital collections and then sharing those digital versions of things back with the community. And we do sometimes work with visual materials, photographs, documents, that kind of thing. But primarily, Queen's Memory has always been based in oral history practice. And we really are a community-driven project, meaning that we are not thinking about what topics we want to approach necessarily from the perspective of being professional historians who have research interests of our own, but instead we try as much as possible to democratize the process of history making by engaging with community members and asking them what people they know living in the borough of Queens who have important stories that ought to be in the archives of the local library, and what people they are interested in interviewing. So we're trying to empower especially communities who are underrepresented in the collections of the public library's local history collections to bring lots of voices into those collections. I mean, when we started the project, many times archival collections, there's a big delay in contemporary history and what is in archival collections, because you tend to get things in an archive after somebody has passed away. Most of the collections were from a pre-1930s Queens, which is fascinating, but extremely different than Queens is now. The borough of Queens is the most ethnically diverse place in the world. And that has really happened since immigration laws changed in the 1960s. So if you really look at an archive that's built from post-1960s history, that is extremely contemporary, and it's something that is very unusual and difficult to grasp. We also, because we're really interested in the stories of families that have migrated from all over the world, countries from everywhere, we find that a lot of times a big part of our job is convincing people that their stories are in fact important to the historical record, and that even though their family's history is not going back generations in Queens, but in fact, maybe they've only lived in Queens for a couple of years, that their story and their family story of migration to this place is something that researchers will in fact be very interested in listening to now and also going into the future. So, developing good relationships of trust with our community members is a really important aspect of our program. And it's something that we, over the years, have been able to cultivate and work on. And something that makes me very happy is when people reach back to us and want to do additional projects. So most of our interviews are life history interviews. They're built on the life history model. And we do lots of trainings with people who are interested in conducting interviews and send volunteers out all over the borough. Also, people sometimes just have someone who they want to interview, and then they come to us for some tips on how to conduct a good interview, and then go out and do that interview with their grandma or whatever, and turn it into us. We also just offer a lot of training for people who are doing their own interview projects, but because we have an educational mission as well as a collecting mission, we sometimes just don't even ever get recordings of those interviews. It's more that we're offering that training and expertise, and then people go out and do their own interviewing projects. And if you go to the website, which I just put in the chat, you can see a little bit about our program. So the way that we function is with this kind of push and pull mission. So we're trying to push local history collections out to the public through public programming, through our various places that we post on the web, through social media. And then we're trying to, while we're out with our community, engage them in the process of history making and bring their stories into the library's collections. So it's pushing and then pulling back in. And, that's really the model of our engagement. In terms of some of the outputs of our program, we, of course, have digital archives, which we have, a digital archives website that has a mixture of materials. We also make our oral histories available on an aviary instance, which we've had a really good experience working with Aviary as a platform for oral history. You can see here our overall collections, and then I'm going to actually share also with you a link to an interview with Megan Regan. So this is an interview where you can see how the transcription that we create is actually synced up with the audio visual material. And so as you kind of zoom through the transcript and you click on something, it will take you to that part of the recording, and they're in sync. So that's one of the things that has made it more interesting to us to have transcriptions. It was something that we did not dedicate the time or resources into doing early on in our practice. So those are some of the ways, as well as just at Queen's Memory, which is our handle for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, no longer Twitter. As well as having these kind of digital platforms, we also produce a podcast, which is entering its 4th season. Each season has 10 episodes, and it's on a particular theme. So the first season is on the theme of migration stories. The second theme was a COVID-19 theme, all recordings with people who were in the middle of the pandemic. The third season was called Our Major Minor Voices. It focuses on Asian American communities across the borough of Queens, and it was produced in 8 different languages. And then this one that we're producing now has all environmental stories. So one of the things that's exciting about working on the Queen's Memory Project is that it is a borough of 2.4 million people. There are a lot of different topics. It's a pretty big tent, right? Like there are lots of different subjects and in particular topics that we can collaborate on. So for instance, when we do an educational collaboration like the ones that we've done with Kristen and her students, we've explored topics like the 1964 World's Fair, where students actually hung out at the Queen's Museum by the giant panorama that was created as part of the 1964 World's Fair, and they conducted like man on the street style interviews, which would be more like the digital storytelling kind of examples that Kristen was talking about. But we also are doing things like continuing interviews with staff, both current and retired, on the Queen's Public Library staff. For it started out as an anniversary project, and now it's just kind of an institutional history project where her students who are training to be librarians can have a one-on-one interview with someone who has had a long career in a public library to both learn from them and have kind of a professional, experience with someone who is a mentor, but also capture their work history and bring that into the collections of the library. So there are all different kinds of sub-themes and topics that we've been able to approach over the years to celebrate different events. So the last thing that I will mention before I stop talking for a little bit is that in my outside of Queen's Memory, some of my professional engagements are as part of the Oral History Association's Metadata Task Force. And I can't be in a talk like this without sharing a toolkit that we've published that is, we hope, very helpful for people who have both existing projects that they can use as an assessment tool for the metadata that they are capturing for the oral histories that they either, like what Kristen was talking about, when you just encounter boxes of stuff and you have to somehow care for it and you're trying to assess what you know about it and what to do with it and how to make it available to people. And also for teams that are starting new oral history projects and they're thinking, trying to think ahead about what information they want to capture so that they don't 10 years later realize that there's something really important that they should have asked their informants when they were sitting with them, and it would have been so easy to find out. So the link that I put in the chat is just our online toolkit that we encourage people at all stages of the oral history life cycle to refer to. And with that, I'll pipe it down. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Natalie. It's interesting that we're on this trajectory now, as Dr. Zilvian mentioned, the evolution of the technologies associated with oral history from, magnetic tapes through optical digital discs, and then now into simply digital, wherever the cloud is type stuff. I'll circle back to the technology in just a minute because I know that for Queen's Memory it was innovative when I first saw it. I was highly impressed with the your mobile digitization lab that you set up. That was like out of a shopping cart, like a rolling suitcase kind of setup. But as the technology evolves, so does the methodology, and that takes us to theirstory.io, which is this emerging platform that incorporates all of these new and highly sophisticated digital technologies that also make oral history and the product, the digital artifact, more accessible. And that's something that I focus on in my day-to-day work, is accessibility and making sure that everything we produce in DLIS is digitally accessible and essentially ADA compliant. And I encourage our students to start thinking about these things and incorporating it into their workflows. I know transcripts are very important for just the value of the artifact. Having a written transcript of an interview can now makes the artifact searchable and discoverable, but it also makes the artifact accessible because now someone with a hearing impairment or deafness can access the interview if it's transcribed. And I used to tell my students to use, I think it was Google Docs had speech to text capability, many years ago. Since COVID, we've seen this advance greatly. That now even in a platform like this, like WebEx, we have kind of real-time captioning capability, and that the the speech to text engines are getting more sophisticated the more we use them. But speaking of, let's get back to theirstory.io. Zach Ellis is here. He's the founder and CEO. I first want to ask .io, right? I know this domain is kind of associated with tech startups and apps. Why did you choose .io for your domain?
Sure. Very simple answer to that question, which was that theirstory.com was taken. So .io was what we went for.
Excellent. All right. Well, tell us more about theirstory.io.
Absolutely. So I'll share a little bit of the context about how their story came to be and what interested me in oral history and this kind of like deeply ethical field, given that I really wasn't exposed to it for a very long time and had more of like a tech background. So I'm actually going to share my screen here if I can. Can you see my screen there, Michael? And
yes.
Everyone? Awesome. And you can see me going between slides here. Yeah.
Yes.
So, as Michael said, I'm Zach Ellis, founder and CEO of Their Story, the end-to-end platform for oral history. And really, my background was actually as a bioengineer, and then I followed two of my college wrestling teammates out to Silicon Valley and worked in software, essentially, and technology companies ranging from API management, how data is exchanged between systems, to working in a home healthcare startup, to working in math education software, and creating social and collaborative math classrooms. And so how the heck did someone like me get into oral history? Was that it largely actually had to do with the personal end of things for me. So I started Their Story as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. And one of the moments that actually changed my life and was incredibly influential was learning the story and meeting the descendants of the German Catholic widow who in the 1930s stood in front of her house in the small town of Hockenberg, Germany, while a mob of Nazi sympathizers were yelling, "Juden raus, all the Jews out," while my grandfather hid inside of her house. And she stood up to the mob, they disbanded, and it's likely because of her courage that I'm here today. And this story was actually not passed down through my family. I learned about it by happenstance my junior year of high school when they actually reached out to us. And while it was happenstance, that story changed my life, changed our family's life. And I imagine a world where the stories of everyday individuals can be accessible for generations to come as easily as making a search on Google or on Ancestry.com. And as Natalie had talked about, really making that process of oral history accessible to everyone. And while that was kind of in the background for a while, I hadn't really taken action on this kind of context until one day. This is actually my dad standing in front of that house that I referenced a moment ago, where the German Catholic widow had stood up to this family, and my dad's biggest regret was never recording his father's stories before he died. And so on a chance visit that I took to Amsterdam, to the Anne Frank house, there was a clip playing on loop of an oral history where Anne's father, Otto, basically concluded that because he had such a close relationship with Anne, but never really knew who she was until after she had died and he read her diary, he believed that most parents don't know really their children. And so it hit me, well, if most parents don't know their kids, how could I know who my parents are? And so I decided that day to start a project over the next 2 years, recording my parents telling their life stories from across the country. I was in San Francisco, they were in Rochester, New York, where I grew up, where I actually live now. And so at that time, this was around 2015 or so, there really wasn't a good remote recording platform or a way to archive the material. And so I would use FaceTime and QuickTime on my computer to record these conversations. And I learned just messing up web development over about 6 months to build kind of the first prototype of their story, a website to host those recordings for my family. And I realized that it was incredibly valuable, kind of two things in particular. One was having these recordings in a safe space online, owned by our family, accessible for generations. And two was the value of the process itself, of engaging in self-reflection, these open dialogues with my parents, now that deepened our relationships and improved our capacity for better communication thereafter. So it was really at that point that their story was born, and kind of asked myself, well, what would this look like to recreate that experience for others in a way that was relevant and meaningful to them? And this was kind of then when I started to stumble on oral history as a formal practice. And so since then, we've partnered with the institutions that are really tasked with preserving and making meaning from human history, and are really the institutions in which oral history practitioners largely work. And so we work with these organizations. There's over 70 since April of 2020, really when lockdown started, that have used their story to streamline their process of collecting, preserving, and making accessible the stories of their communities. Everything from for independent oral history projects to student use of the platform in a more like social collaborative setting, together with partners, for example, St. John's University and Queens Public Library. And so Marion will talk a little bit more about his experience and what this actually looks like in practice. And I think the problems it really helps to address is you might be thinking to yourself, well, why not just use Zoom, or why not just use a couple of technologies I already use? And it really is about managing the logistical burden of having to use so many disparate applications, none of which are really integrated. They don't really take archival practices and metadata to heart, which creates a lot of burden at the final stage of how to archive this, make it accessible, disseminate it. And so we've seen that institutions, especially if you're using it in the classroom, we had one university in particular that had a story of students were using Zencastr, having to download that material, upload it to Trint for AI transcription, download the transcripts, send it back to the professor to organize on Dropbox, who then gave access through Dropbox to all these disparate files to the library, who had to index it, do some video editing, and only then make it accessible, many months later, if not year or more. And as Natalie had mentioned, this process, 1960 footage seems like almost really relevant today, because it's a really long process that has really high ethical standards, and all of this takes time and costs a lot of money to do at scale. And so their story really is a platform to try and democratize that process all in one system, and make it really approachable and easy to do. So everything from podcast quality remote recording to AI transcription, the ability to index materials to kind of pull out key moments. Someone might talk about the idea of segregation for 10 minutes, but never mention the word segregation. So how do we identify some of these cross-cutting themes? How do we then make it easy to actually pull out key moments and transform long-form audiovisual content into short-form narratives that are easy to consume, but connecting back to its context? So being able to highlight a piece of that AI transcript or a transcript that's been edited by a human, but that's connected to the media. Natalie talked about how Aviary does this really well, and how the Memory Project allows you to kind of search and connect between the transcript and the media. And being able to use the transcript where I can just highlight a piece of that transcript and actually then pull out a clip that I might then share, disseminate, or use in, say, a podcast episode that I might create, or then share and make accessible via Aviary, YouTube, other platforms, that people can then engage with that content and make use of it. So that's a little bit about how their story came to be, how it's used, and would love to pass it off to Marion to talk about what Marion's experience was really in going through this process together with the Queens Memory Project and conducting oral history and making use of it.
Thank you, Zach. That's great information. We'll circle back and I'll ask some follow-up questions in a few moments. Marion, if you could please walk us through your personal experience as a student in our program using these technologies, and what you think could be a possible application for your future career.
Sure. Hi, my name is Marion Ward. As was stated, I am a current MIS candidate at St. John's University. I am quickly approaching on my final semester, which I'm very excited about. And over the course of my time at St. John's, I've had the opportunity to work with some wonderful folks, three of which have spoken before me, which has been really great. I had the opportunity to take Dr. Sylvian's oral history course in the spring. And also within that course, had the opportunity to meet Natalie, work with the Queen's Memory Project. The project that we undertook within Dr. Sylvian's course was to go out and interview current and past staff members within the Queen's Public Library system. I had the opportunity to interview a gentleman by the name of Daniel Finger, who's a wonderful associate director of the Forest Hills branch, I believe, of the Queen's Public Library. And oral history had always been sort of as a topic itself, something that I was very interested in as a child, long before I knew I was going to eventually go for a terminal degree in library sciences, long before I was even thinking of like terms of a career, maybe wanted to be an astronaut or something. At the time, I had no idea. But I grew up in the Appalachian region. I grew up in North Georgia. And was surrounded by the Foxfire series. And these were just books that I grew up with, that I remember having on the shelf. And snagging a link just to make everybody's like these here, and everybody also wants to check it out. I believe this is a link to where some of the magazines can be accessed. But Foxfire is this project that was initiated in the 1960s, so right around America's bicentennial. We have this boom of people being very interested in folklore and different methods of history, which kind of predated that as well, but we sort of at this moment, it seems, of collectively of America looking around and going, well, we've reached 200 almost. Who are we? How do we report these histories? And also this popular interest within that, which is certainly just continuing to grow as we come into the current digital age. So going through these books around, just like reading these different essentially transcripts that have been recorded by students going out into the field, engaging within this project. And this project is still ongoing with folks that call the Appalachian Mountain Range home. Some of them will tell everything ranging from ghost stories to hog dressing, barn raising. It's huge. It's a gigantic project. And then sort of summarily forgotten about that. These were just books that I had been raised with as I was going through high school and considering college options. So I went to Yale University. I graduated in 2015, so a little bit of a gap between when I graduated my undergrad and when I got to start at St. John's University. And during my time at Yale, first of all, I found myself as a little bit of a fish out of water, Southern boy, what have you. But immediately fell in love with archival practice. I started working at their manuscripts and archives, and also at Meineke Rare Books Library, primarily manuscripts and archives, though, and really had this moment of getting to, within an academic archival setting specifically, getting to put my hands on all of these, like, old letters, old journals. Maybe, like, it was just fascinating. I don't know how else to describe it. And realized at that moment, even though as I was like taking these courses, very Ivy League tier, ivory tower, if you will, perspective of history, getting to feel like I was holding history in my hands, and then working towards at that time the digitization of that. And technology has changed so rapidly over the course of the past, since oral history was officially, founded as or formalized as a research methodology in the 40s, on to now. It's just at breakneck speed things change. We talk about that a lot within various courses at St. John's University, but it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing new, and sometimes it feels like a struggle just to keep up with it. I say that to say, I remember being a student at Yale and holding this crumbling letter in my hands that was in desperate need of preservation that they did was trying to move it very delicately to digitize it. And me just thinking my life was over. And, you know, like maybe I'm fired. Oh my God, do I get kicked out of the university? I don't know. Just like all this stuff. Taking it to my supervisors, this and wonderful team of archivists that I worked with at the time, and then having a solution. But realizing this moment of like this crumbling, like, oh, there's a sense of urgency around all of this. And I'm remembering back to, you know, smash cut to 2 years ago now when I applied to St. John's University, and knowing at the time, like, well, interested in library sciences, library and information sciences, interested in archival practices and trying to learn what best practices are, carrying with me this phrase of a sense of urgency. And during my time at Yale as well, I had exposure to oral history as a research methodology, where I was not involved in reporting oral histories within the community. Now, looking back, I really wish I had. New Haven is a beautifully rich and diverse town. But working specifically with two collections that were within manuscripts and archives, which was the same Milgram experiments and transcripts from that. So not technically oral history on that one, but transcripts and seeing how that works in the digitization process there. But also the Fortunoff archive, which for anybody that is not familiar, was a project that was undertaken, spearheaded by Steven Spielberg, recording video recording interviews of Holocaust survivors. And seeing at that time how Yale had just started to undergo this digitization process of what was just VCR tapes, and they were crumbling. The process that researchers had to go through in order to access these videos was to literally check out these crumbling tapes, go in the back, pop them into a VCR, sit in headphones. And, you know, this is taking a lot of presuppositions of, you know, who has access to Yale's library, right? Who has access to these tapes to be able to, you know, maybe pay out the nose to go travel and sit in front of these. And this was what led at the time, aside from who's going to save these tapes and make sure that they're not what, you know, Dr. Silvian was describing as, you know, this closet full of tapes that's just like, what do I do with this? And those efforts have been ongoing as well, as far as, you know, getting them off of, this was almost 10 years ago, I'm speaking now. But that leads me to a point that some folks before me have hit on as well, as far as like accessibility. So another question that I had the opportunity, so I've talked a fair amount about you know, my own career interests, archival practices, getting to also with their story and using you know, Zach's platform, getting to see what it is like to record using modern technology that is evolving and keeping up with what interview recording can be, and preservation. Getting to go and do that within Dr. Silvian's class this summer, I had the opportunity to sort of start to zoom out and look at these like larger theoretical questions, because I found myself with this academic history training on one end, preservation, crumbling tapes, terror of the ripped page, that kind of thing on the other, and trying to figure out, okay, what is the driving force between the two of these? And realizing, at least for me, and I would argue, that the ideas of best practice for within archival services, and speaking as somebody that is aspiring to be an information, to be a librarian working in information services, best practice in being an ethical archivist, also the more I engage with it, and the more I listen to these folks that have a wealth of experience, and way more than I do at this point, it must include oral history. It must include this narrative of preservation, because so during the summer, I had the opportunity to read the work Silencing the Past by a dissertation scholar named Michelle Pierce-Trejo. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. This was published in 1995, and is largely a theoretical, looking at the theories of history of what do history's narratives say, and what do its silences, who is writing history. Another wonderful book that Zach Ellis recommended to me that kind of touches on those same topics is Sharing Authority by Michael Frisch, which was published in 1990, I believe. So mentioning dates, because these are questions that people have been sitting with for a long time. And within Sharing Authority, there's this question of, you know, who narrates history, times when we share the authorship of history, because I feel that there's this view within education that oral history certainly challenges. It's not the only research methodology that challenges it by any far stretch, but it is one of them. Is this idea of the old cliche, history is written by the victors, history is written by powerful people. So when we engage in questioning those sorts of narratives, how do we, and specifically, how do we as hopeful information science professionals, those that hope to engage in communities within library spaces and within, for me specifically, archival spaces, how do we make voices that might not otherwise be heard? How do we apply academic research rigor to that? How do we not just preserve things for the sake of silencing the past? There's this phrase that the author uses called the fetishization of the document, which sounds maybe a bit extreme, but points to, I believe, what Natalie was talking about before. We are in a post-custodial world. We are in a post-custodial information sciences landscape. So how do we move through with that, and then with these questions of what are we preserving, why are we preserving it, who are we preserving it for? And within my own interest and sort of research history and things that I got to engage in this past summer, there's this wonderful project, and it is not, as I mentioned, Foxfire before. Foxfire is not its own thing. It's its own wealth of, or it's not in isolation, rather. It's its own, has its own wealth of information there, but there's also myriad other projects, one of which is called the Appalachian Oral History Project. And let me see if I can pull a link to that up. The director of which is a gentleman by the name of Scott Sykes. Now, I mentioned this project as, so this was associated with Emory and Henry College in Western Virginia, not West Virginia, Western Virginia, and a couple of other universities that are in the surrounding area. Was founded in 1973, I believe, and was another classroom effort. So that was another really nice experience, a very interesting experience, is realizing that while I was in Dr. Sylvian's class of learning how to do oral histories and working with this memory project, that has its own history. That pedagogical method has its own history within throughout the United States. But within the Appalachian Oral History project, they're working through digitizing thousands of interviews. I believe on Omega currently there's maybe just shy of 700 interviews that are fully transcribed, have the metadata there, and have been fully digitized and are freely available without any sort of university login or what have you. But in having the opportunity to speak with Scott Sykes, the director of this program, and getting to pick his brain a little bit, his primary interest seems to be, or to ally with, again, how do we give voice to these voices and these stories, and looking at history as a narrative. It's facts and data and things that you can collect from it as well. I certainly don't want to negate that. But preserving these voices and amplifying these voices that might otherwise not be heard. So in 2021, Dr. Sykes went out into the field. So these original interviews were recorded in the early 1970s, again, right around that bicentennial. In 2021, Sykes went out into the field with, actually I have, I pulled up JSTOR to this article where he describes it as full. But he goes out into the field, and instead, I thought this was in itself such an interesting method and exemplifies some of the points that are very important at the core of oral history and methodologies like it. He goes out to find the family members, the friends of different people that had recorded specifically Black Appalachian interviews. That had recorded these interviews, and the narrators in these interviews in the early 1970s. He takes the recordings of these interviews, reaches out to these individuals, essentially hits play, and then records the interaction of that individual with, say, hearing their deceased uncle's voice for the first time. for the first time in 20 years or something like that. And previously it was mentioned this sort of tension between oral history as science, as methodology, but also as art. And I remember taking part in Dr. Slogan's class and being fascinated and so frustrated by that. At least for sort of, I guess, my own academic background, and I don't believe I'm alone in this, wanting everything to have a concrete answer, wanting everything to have a truth, wanting everything to have, this exact data point, realizing a lot of things do, but also realizing being open to the beauty of oral history as research methodology, in that we are reporting stories. We are, and the facts and everything that goes along with it too, but these two are so matched. It's a recording of essentially a human relationship, of a discussion between two people. There is a very human element to it. And I believe I will leave it, or begin to leave it there, in just that this is, first of all, being part of this camp was wonderful. And getting to hear all of these voices and being able to go into this deep dive on oral history as somebody that did just start out as, seeing some, being able to pull books off of a shelf as a kid and read these transcripts of people that sounded like my aunts and uncles and family, and being able to be a part, hopefully, as I'm moving forward in my career, of preserving something similar in, a modern format for other community constituents of whatever library where I work, where I wind up working, and also going into curating more oral histories and being part of projects like that, so other folks can also have that experience.
Yeah, it's really, thank you, Marion, for your contribution. My takeaway from today's discussion is that oral history serves not just the person doing the research, not the user at the archive, not just that person. And it's not just the person conducting the interview. It also serves the person being interviewed, the subject, right? So primarily that person's story is being told and being preserved. And the value of that kind of just grows exponentially, especially if you do something like Queen's Memory Project or Their Story, which is to make these histories accessible. And that impacts the community around that person, and the community of users at that end space again. This is something that we've talked about in the Division of Library and Information Science at St. John's University as part of our Catholic and Vincentian mission. St. Vincent charges us to serve the poor. And oral histories can be used as part of that by collecting testimonial, by collecting stories of people in all walks of life and in all socioeconomic brackets. We paint a broader picture of our society, and that can inform policy decisions at a macro scale, right? We've heard from a former student, an alumna of ours who's now a scholar. She's now the head of oral history, I think, at a community college in the Bronx. She's teaching oral history now. She talked to us about using oral history to fight gentrification in Brooklyn. She went down to Bushwick, where she grew up, and she started interviewing her neighbors from childhood and getting their stories about the neighborhood and about how it changed. And she was able to play those stories for the city council and show the politicians these aren't just bodies occupying valuable real estate on the rental market in New York City. These are people, persons with stories and histories. This is a community that's being displaced. And so she was able to use oral history to help preserve the physical community that she grew up in. And so, as somebody in the chat just mentioned, poor can also be defined by those lacking information and those without a recorded history. Absolutely, that's the point. And this discussion, we call it the Dark Ages. It's not because humanity fell down a hole. It's because we don't have first-person sources to talk about what day-to-day life was like during that period of European history, where only the 10% of the population was literate, and the only things being written down were copies of scripture. So we don't know we find all of these artifacts in archaeology, and then people have to kind of figure out what they do and how they worked and how would they be incorporated into daily life hundreds and thousands of years ago, because we don't have primary sources about what that object was and how it was integrated into daily life. So oral history is a broader part, as Dr. Sylvian said. It's going on decades now that it's been formalized. Natalie shared with us the metadata standards from the Oral History Association and Columbia University. It's worth exploring, and I think incorporating this into the practice. My husband used to be a children's librarian, and he incorporated oral history when StoryCorps was going on. He wanted to hear his children's department served children up until the 6th grade. And so he wanted to hear from 6th graders what their experience had been in the children's room. And so he was asking 12-year-olds who started using the library, as infants, what their experiences was, who were their favorite librarians, what were their favorite programs. And that's something that, if that goes on the cloud, if that goes on a website, that's great fodder to embarrass that kid at his wedding. There's myriad uses and applications of oral history, and I think this panel and this discussion really helped shine a light on the various aspects of it. And as the technology evolves, and it will continue, it's inevitable, these things will be a lot faster. That time frame, we talked about this during COVID, during lockdown. I had a panel of librarians, archivists, and I said, it's a great time to address the backlog of digitization of archival materials. We're past that. Now transcripts are generated almost instantaneously, at least you're not manually entering. You can go in and find edits and tweak them, and then transitioning. The publication, what their story is doing is making these stories, capturing these testimonials, and making these narratives available as quickly as possible and in one solid space. And that's really where the future of oral history is going in terms of collecting. The uses, as Dr. Sylvia mentioned, we talk about knowledge management in corporate librarianship and capturing exit interviews and capturing the moment of information, those instances. Oral history can be used to train incoming employees. Oral history can be used as to indoctrinate or enculturate people transitioning careers and transitioning into new fields. So there's value in this, and we would love to hear from more engineers and mathematicians and those kinds of people about the evolution of their practice and their fields for future students in those areas. So academically, we've seen its application in our curriculum. Professionally, we know what Natalie's doing is it's essentially changing the history of Queens by capturing the history of Queens and democratizing the history of Queens in a way that's never been done before. I remember when it first launched, I lived about a quarter mile away from Natalie's office, and I had emailed her, and I had seen her in the press, and I had seen her, and we met 3 years later at ALA in San Francisco. It's the first time we met face to face. So I've been following your work this whole time, and it's impactful. I've seen it, having been a long-time resident of Queens and going to the Queens Museum and going to the Queens Library. The relationship, Queens Museum had oral histories captured in Queens memory that you could play at a museum exhibit on the evolution of activism in Queens. And that interaction, seeing users listen to those testimonials and identify and say, I think I know this person, and that it strengthens the community because now we have ownership of our story and we have ownership of our place, and that's really valuable. So again, there's value in oral history on both sides of the table, and then in the archive and for the users. And we don't know how it's going to be used 50 years down the road, but we need to tell our stories now. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Natalie, Zach, Marion and Dr. Zilvian. This is great. A recording will be made available on YouTube, and everybody who registered for today's meeting will get a link to that recording. Thanks again on behalf of the Division of Library and Information Science at St. John's University Student Association, DeLISA. Enjoy the rest of the summer. We'll see you in the fall. All right, folks, thanks for coming, and we'll talk soon. I'm going to send you, I'll update you with all of the end materials.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
So